This chapter delves into the psychological and tactical mindset of the Imperial Japanese Naval Air Service leading up to the critical moment in September 1943. It will establish the unchallenged dominance of the Mitsubishi A6M Zero, exploring its revolutionary design, the elite training of its pilots, and the statistical reality that fueled Japanese overconfidence. The narrative opens with an expanded scene of Rabaul, grounding the laughter in the solid, quantifiable victories of the preceding 2 years. The unsinkable air fortress. The date was September 1st, 1943. The air in the operations tent at Rabaul Airfield, New Britain, was thick with the suffocating humidity of the South Pacific, a dampness that clung to the starched uniforms and blurred the ink on the maps. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, his eye, the one remaining, scanning the latest enemy intelligence report, couldn't suppress a burst of genuine, deep-seated laughter. It wasn't a nervous chuckle, but a resonant, contemptuous sound that drew the attention of the assembled pilots. The report, relayed from neutral Swedish sources and filtered through the Combined Fleet's own intelligence section, detailed the specifications of the U.S. Navy's newest carrier fighter, the Grumman F6F Hellcat. The name itself, Hellcat, seemed an overblown, typically American piece of propaganda. The numbers, however, were the source of Sakai's amusement. The Hellcat was described as a brute, loaded weight approaching 12,000 pounds, a wide fuselage and a wing area suggesting the drag of a transport plane. The report explicitly noted it weighed nearly twice the 5,800-pound operational weight of their own masterpiece, the Zero. For Sakai, an ace who had perfected the art of aerial combat based on maneuverability and lightness, these specifications were a joke of tragic proportions. They build fighters like they build cars, heavy, overbuilt, wasteful. This Hellcat Shelley was simply the Americans continuing their failed philosophy, attempting to overcome the profound skill gap of their pilots with the brute force of machinery. For 2 years, the A6M Zero had established a reign of terror that transcended mere tactical superiority. It was an article of faith. Its legendary performance, achieved through an almost spiritual devotion to lightness and speed, had allowed it to dominate every major theater of the Pacific War. The British Hurricanes over Singapore, the American P-40s in the Philippines, the Dutch Brewster Buffaloes in the East Indies, all had fallen before the Zero's guns with embarrassing ease. The statistics meticulously recorded by the Imperial Japanese Naval Air Service since December 7, 1941, were less battlefield data than proof of destiny. At Pearl Harbor, 29 Japanese aircraft lost versus 347 destroyed American aircraft. In the Philippines, the ratio was an eye-watering 7 losses against 103 kills. Over Darwin, 2 losses for 30 destroyed. These were not just victories, they were mathematical annihilation. This confidence, this certainty that their aircraft and their elite pilot corps were inherently superior was the very foundation of the rising sun zenith. The Japanese Navy's pilot training program was the most rigorous in the world. A 3-year ordeal that turned raw recruits into samurai of the sky, entering combat with over 700 hours of flight time. They were artists, trained in complex aerobatics, demanding gunnery discipline and deeply imbued with the spiritual philosophy of Bushido. Their skill was intended to overcome any material deficiency, but with the Zero, they had both skill and the superior machine. The Zero itself was a masterpiece of compromise. To achieve its impossible range and breathtaking maneuverability, its designer, Professor Jiro Horiguchi, had made a series of revolutionary yet ultimately fatal decisions. The use of extra superduralium and a classified lightweight aluminum alloy allowed the airframe to be 30% lighter than its contemporary American counterparts.
every ounce was sacrificed at the altar of performance. There was no armor plate protecting the pilot. There were no self-sealing fuel tanks, a safety feature considered a superfluous weight penalty. Even the radio equipment, crucial for coordinated tactics, was often removed by pilots to shave off another 30 pounds. Warrant Officer Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, Japan's aces, perfectly encapsulated the Zero's essence in his diary. Flying the Zero is like rearing wings. The aircraft responds to thought, not just control input. American planes, he observed, fly like trucks. This philosophy was confirmed when American engineers first tested the captured Zero, the famed Akatan Zero in 1942. Their initial reaction to the performance figures, a fighter with the range of a bomber and a turning radius of a biplane, was disbelief, suspecting fabrication. It seemed an impossible machine, perfectly suited to the Japanese fighter tactics that centered entirely on the turning flight, or dogfight. With a low wing loading of 22 pounds per square foot, the Zero could turn inside any Allied fighter, a maneuverability advantage that was virtually an execution sentence with the enemy. The intelligence reports on the Hellcat reaching Captain Minor of Gunda, the tactical genius behind the Pearl Harbor attack, were met with the same professional dismissal. Gunda, reviewing the specifications, the Hellcat's 36.5 pounds per square foot wing loading and its corresponding large turning radius, concluded the Americans have learned nothing. This Hellcat represents the continuation of their failed philosophy. A Zero will fly circles around it. His logic was irrefutable based on the accepted rules of air combat. In a turning flight, the Hellcat would be helpless. Gunda's analysis, preserved in the Japanese Defense Archives, codified the Imperial Navy's official underestimation. The mathematics of the dogfight seemed to guarantee the Zero's eternal supremacy. The laughter at Rabaul was not arrogance. It was the perfectly rational confidence of a force that had built its dominance on an elegant, proven equation. They believed the new American design was simply too heavy, too clumsy, and too slow in the turn to pose a credible threat. What Sakai and his compatriots failed to grasp was that the F6F Hellcat had not been designed to compete with the Zero. It had been designed to obsolete the very rules by which the Zero fought. Its weight was not a design failure, but a calculated choice. That 12,000 pounds represented 212 pounds of armor plate to protect the pilot, 110 pounds of self-sealing fuel tanks, the oil system, and the immense concentrated power of the Pratt & Whitney 2800 double wasp engine. This engine, producing 2,000 horsepower, offered a performance envelope, particularly in climb and dive speed, that the Zero's lighter engine could not approach. The Hellcat was the first physical manifestation of a strategic pivot by the United States Navy, a transition from the bourgeois philosophy of the individual warrior to the industrial age philosophy of the weapon system that protected its pilot and optimized for survivability and coordination. The Japanese laughed because the Hellcat looked wrong, flew heavy, and seemed to violate their principles. They were laughing at a relic from a previous age, the principle of this sword, while facing the dawn of the industrial-scale disposable machine gun. Unbeknownst to them, the mathematics of aerial supremacy were about to be rewritten, and the foundation of their fatal assumptions would soon crumble beneath the relentless, terrifying logic of the American industrial democracy. The curtain was rising on the final tragic act of the Zero's dominance.
This chapter focuses on the initial shock of combat, the first encounters between the Zero and the Hellcat. It details the specific tactical differences, introducing the concept of energy fighting, and the devastating effectiveness of the Hellcats' firepower and armor. Individual Japanese pilot accounts, like that of Petty Officer Fukui, will illustrate the moment when the Zero's tactical doctrine failed against the Hellcat's sheer power. The unprecedented ascent and the broken doctrine. The date of the first true encounter, a strategic, coordinated test of the new design, was just 30 days after Sakai's dismissive laughter. On September 30th, 1943, near Marcus Island, the reality of the Hellcat crashed into the established order of the Pacific War. Petty Officer First Class Yoshio Fukui was flying escort for a reconnaissance mission, his mind perhaps dwelling on the familiar elegance of air combat, the ballet of turns and dives that defined the Zero's domain. He spotted 6 dark blue shapes climbing from the southeast. His first impression, recorded in his after-action report, was of B-25 bombers on a strange heading. Then, as they turned, he saw the silhouette, massive fuselage, single engine, wings that seemed too short for the body. This, he realized, was the F6F type fighter from the intelligence reports. Fukui's reaction was textbook Zero doctrine, engaged with standard tactics. Standard tactics meant utilizing the Zero's superior turn rate to get onto the enemy's tail, a maneuver that should have been an easy kill against a fighter described as a torpedo bomber. Fukui rolled into a diving turn, expecting the heavy American fighter to continue straight, an invitation to curve effortlessly onto its 6 o'clock position. What happened next was unprecedented, a direct violation of the physics that had governed air combat for 2 years. The Hellcat didn't try to turn, it didn't flee, it went vertical. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, a masterpiece of American engineering, was the heart of the Hellcat's power, generating a formidable 2,000 horsepower, a crushing 700 horsepower advantage over the Zero's Nakajima Sakai. It drove the Hellcat skyward at a blistering 3,500 feet per minute. Fukui, tempting to follow, watched his airspeed decay rapidly. The Zero, built for lightness, struggled against the relentless pull of gravity. It was a race for altitude that the Zero was never designed to win. At approximately 15,000 feet, an altitude where the Zero was gasping for oxygen and its performance was already degrading, the Hellcat executed a maneuver that should have been physically impossible for its weight, a tight, precise, hammerhead turn that reversed its direction and dropped it like a stone directly onto Fukui's tail. The Zero pilot was suddenly, violently on the defensive. The American opened fire at 400 meters, 6 machine guns, not the 4 we expected. The volume of fire was unprecedented. This was the second shock. The Hellcat was armed with 6 formidable Browning M2 .50 caliber machine guns. Each gun fired 750 rounds per minute, totaling 4,500 rounds per minute. Each .50 caliber bullet weighed 46 grams and delivered 3,500 foot-pounds of energy. The Zero's 7.7mm guns fired projectiles weighing 11 grams, delivering only 750 foot-pounds of energy. This disparity, but the Hellcat delivered 16 times the destructive kinetic energy per second of the Zero's guns. The metal of the Zero was literally shredded. My aircraft took 17 hits in 3 seconds. Only by dropping into a spin did I escape. Fukui survived, his Zero a sieve of bullet holes, but his wingman, Petty Officer Second Class Masao, did not return. The Zero's doctrine had not just failed, it had proven fatal. This brutal initiation introduced the concept of energy fighting, a doctrine that the Japanese pilots would fatally struggle to grasp. The Hellcat pilot, trained in the U.S. Navy's new tactical manuals, refused the Zero's preferred turn-and-burn fight. Instead, the Hellcat focused on maintaining high potential energy, altitude, and high kinetic energy, speed. Converting one into the other only for fleeting, violent attacks, they fought like executioners, not duelists. The strategy was simple and devastating. Zoom climb. Use superior horsepower to gain altitude above the enemy. Slash attack. Dive down at maximum speed,
fire a massive burst using gravity and speed as a weapon, and rely on armor to shrug off inevitable return fire. Zoom climb away. Use the momentum and superior engine power to climb rapidly back to a position of energy advantage, refusing to slow down or turn with the Zero. The decisive tactical validation occurred on October 5, 1943, when Task Force 1-4 struck Wape Island. Lieutenant Yoshio Shiga led 12 Zeros from the 252nd Air Group to intersect. Shiga, a confident veteran, climbed to 20,000 feet, believing victory was certain, giving their altitude and position advantage over the American fighters below. When the Zeros dove, the Hellcats did not scatter. They maintained formation and accelerated, keeping their energy high. As the Zeros opened fire, hoping to score disabling hits, the Hellcats demonstrated the crushing effectiveness of American industrial design. The 212 pounds of armor, the 110 pounds of oil system protection, and the self-sealing fuel tanks allowed the F6F to absorb punishment that would have instantly annihilated the Zero. The Japanese pilots were effectively emptying their ammunition into what felt like flying bunkers. The counterattack was the ultimate expression of the weight paradox. The Hellcat used its weight not as a liability, but as a weapon. They climbed at full power, reaching altitudes where the unturbocharged Mekajima Sakai engine struggled desperately for oxygen. At 25,000 feet, the Hellcat was still producing approximately 1,650 horsepower, while the Zero was counted 900 horsepower. The superior engine and the Hellcat could dominate the high-altitude fight where speed and climb rate were king. They came down on us like hawks on sparrows, Shiga wrote in his diary. Their weight gave them speed we couldn't match. They would dive, fire the 6 temperable guns, then climb away before we could react. In that engagement, 8 Zeros were shot down. No Hellcats were lost. The immediate aftermath was one of confusion and disbelief in the AGIs. Veteran pirates were reporting tactics that defied their training, aircraft that could withstand a torrent of cannon fire, and maneuvers that violated the known limits of heavy fighters. These reports were often filtered through the same old guard, Legenda, who initially suspected pilot error, poor trading, or perhaps deliberate Allied misinformation. The failure was not seen as a machine flaw, but a human one. Yet the accumulating evidence was terrified. On November 11, 1943, at Rabaul, Lieutenant Commander Taft Demenitu, a 32 Victory A's who survived multiple encounters, delivered a briefing to the 240th Air Group that was a chilling pronouncement of the death of traditional doctrine. Forget everything you know about air combat. The Americans had changed the rules. They don't fight our fight. They fight like executioners, not duelists. Tenenitsu explicitly described the new American doctrine. The F6F was designed to never need to turn with the Zero. Hellcat pilots used energy fighting, maintaining speed and altitude to deliver slashing attacks. He also highlighted the critical role of their technology. Their radios, which use RAFTEF for adding weight, let them coordinate perfectly. We fly as individual samurai. They fight as a machine. The philosophical gulf was now becoming clear. The Zero represented the individual warrior, while the Hellcat represented the systematic machine of industrial warfare. The age of the samurai in the air was over, and the age of the industrial coordinated weapon system had begun its silent, relentless advance.
This chapter shifts focus from the tactical battle to the underlying technological and industrial asymmetry. It contrasts the Hellcat's powerful Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine with the Zero's Nakajima Sakai, detailing the massive difference in horsepower and reliability. Crucially, it explores the American innovation of radar-guided fighter direction and the sheer scale of Grumman's production miracle, setting the stage for the catastrophic loss of experienced Japanese pilots. The engine's truth and the eye of the radar. By the spring of 1944, the initial shock of the Hellcat's arrival had matured into a grim, dawning realization within the Japanese combined fleet. The problem was no longer just a new enemy fighter. It was a fundamental, unbridgeable technology chasm that revealed the catastrophic lag in Japanese industrial capacity. Commander Mitsuo Sochida, the same officer who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor, now served as the Air Operations Officer, and his inspection of damaged Zeros returning from combat revealed the core of the problem. The heart of the Hellcat's superiority was its engine, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp. This twin-row, 18-cylinder radial engine was a marvel of precision engineering, capable of producing 2,000 horsepower. Fuchida's engineers quickly discerned that this engine was not just more powerful, it was manufactured to a standard of reliability and interchangeability that was utterly foreign to the Japanese system. Later examination would reveal that the R2800 contained 2,840 precision-machined parts, each interchangeable with any other R2800 engine. In stark contrast, the Zero's Nakajima Sakai engine, while light and initially efficient, was lower in power, only 1,130 horsepower at full throttle. More critically, its components often required hand-fitting by specialized mechanics. No two engines were exactly alike, a symptom of an industry prioritizing artisanal craftsmanship over mass, standardized production. This meant that while an American mechanic could swiftly swap out a damaged R2800 component with a part pulled directly from a box, the Japanese mechanics faced painstaking, time-consuming repairs that were often impossible in the forward operating bases. The difference was not just 700 horsepower, it was the difference between an industrial machine and a handmade artifact. Beyond raw power, the most unsettling technological advantage lay in a realm the Japanese had actively rejected as superfluous weight: radio and radar guidance. Japanese pilots still relied almost exclusively on eyesight to spot enemies. Meanwhile, Hellcat pilots were being factored to their targets by shipboard radar controllers, systems that could detect Japanese aircraft up to 50 miles away. Lieutenant Sadamo Kumachi, a surviving pilot, described the experience of his first radar-directed interception. "We were climbing through clouds when they hit us. No warning, no visual contact. Hellcats diving from above, exactly on our heading, perfectly positioned. They knew where we were. Our altitude, our course, we were blind men fighting those who could see in the dark." This was the industrialization of air combat. The enemy was no longer a visible, maneuverable target, but a blip on the screen, which the American system converted into a perfect, inescapable ambush. The Hellcat was not an individual fighter. It was the sharp, coordinated extension of a massive, technologically advanced fleet system. The third pillar of the Hellcat's dominance was the production miracle engineered by Grumman. The factory in Bethpage, New York was transformed into an assembly line operating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. At its peak, a new F6F Hellcat rolled off the assembly line every 60 minutes. Grumman produced a total of 12,275 Hellcats in 30 months. Japanese leaders literally could not comprehend this scale. In 1944, a peak year for their own war effort, Japan produced a total of 5,100 fighters of all types, a number dwarfed by the 35,000 fighters the United States produced in that same year alone. The American system utilized innovations that seemed impossible to Japanese observers, workers using color-coded instructions for complex assembly, quality control maintained despite speed, and a willingness to simplify design for rapid manufacturing. The Zero, a masterpiece of lightweight complexity, took exponentially longer to manufacture and required more skilled labor. The combination of the superior machine, power, armor, and reliable engine, and the superior system, radar guidance, and mass production, led directly to the accelerating pilot equation crisis for the IJNAS. The pre-war program had produced the world's elite aviators, requiring 3 years and 700 hours of flight time.
But as veteran pilots were consumed by the Hellcat, the replacement pool was desperately thin. By early 1944, the required flight time for naval pilots entering combat was slashed to 300 hours, and for Army pilots, only 200 hours. Fuel shortages meant that critical training, instrument flight, night flight, and even basic gunnery practice was severely limited or eliminated. Lieutenant Commander Yoshihiro Hashimoto, a training officer, wrote in a final report that summed up the tragedy. "We are sending children to fight professionals." He recounted a new ensign arriving at the front who had never fired his guns in flight due to the lack of ammunition for practice. That pilot, he noted, lasted 7 minutes in his first combat. The American pilot, meanwhile, was arriving with 300 hours minimum, including 50 hours in type, having fired thousands of practice rounds and drilled relentlessly in the new energy tactics over safe airfields. The Hellcat, a durable, stable, and forgiving machine, allowed the relatively less experienced American pilot to succeed, protecting him during mistakes. The Zero, highly sensitive and demanding, offered no such margin for error. The gap was no longer one of skill versus machine. It was a gap between a national system that prioritized the preservation of its warriors through technology then mass, and a system that prioritized the sacrifice of its warriors through spiritual purity and lightweight design. The final crushing industrial reality was dawning. No matter how skilled the Japanese pilot, he was fighting a losing battle against a system that could replace 2 lost Hellcats with 10 new ones flown by pilots who knew exactly where to find their quarry, long before the Zero pilot could even see his opponent. This asymmetry of production and technology was the powder keg set for the massive, decisive battles to come.
This chapter focuses on the apex of the Hellcat's dominance, the Battle of the Philippine Sea, universally known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. It details the Japanese strategy for a decisive battle, Operation A-Go, the perfection of American radar vectoring, Combat Information Center, CIC, and the resulting systematic annihilation of 4 waves of Japanese carrier aircraft. The narrative highlights the profound strategic implications of the victory and the individual heroism of the American aces who flew the F6F. Operation A-Go, the fateful commitment. By the early summer of 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy knew it faced an existential crisis. The slow attrition of the previous 9 months, punctuated by the brutal encounters with the Hellcat described in Chapter 2 and the paralyzing industrial asymmetry detailed in Chapter 3, had decimated the veteran pilot corps. The strategic objective had become desperately simple: force a decisive battle, inflict catastrophic losses on the American carrier fleet, and regain the strategic initiative. This was the genesis of Operation A-Go, the planned decisive battle that would determine the fate of the Pacific. The Japanese commitment was total. Vice Admiral Saburo Ozawa, commander of the 1st Mobile Fleet, gathered the remnants of Japanese carrier power. 9 carriers, including the powerful Taiho and Shokaku, carrying approximately 450 aircraft alongside the best remaining aircrews the Empire could muster. Many rushed through training. Ozawa planned to leverage the Zero's one remaining advantage: its superior range. By launching his strikes from extreme distances, up to 400 miles, he hoped to catch the American task force off guard, inflicting damage and escaping before the superior Hellcats could fully engage. His strategy relied on the American carriers being vulnerable platforms that had to be attacked first to be neutralized. Facing Ozawa was the might of the United States Navy's Task Force 58, commanded by Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher. This was a force fundamentally reshaped by the Hellcat. Mitcher possessed 15 fleet and light carriers carrying 956 aircraft, over 450 of which were the F6F Hellcat. Crucially, the American fleet no longer saw its carriers as vulnerable. The Hellcat had inverted this strategic equation. The carriers were now mobile armored air fortresses, protected by a dense, technologically guided umbrella. Mitri's simple philosophy, reinforced by the F6F's performance, was, with the Hellcat, we don't need to find them first. Let them. This chapter explores the sophisticated combat doctrine developed by the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps to maximize the Hellcat's strengths against the Zero's weaknesses. It contrasts the American emphasis on teamwork and energy management, the boom and zoom, and the thatch weave, with the Japanese focus on individual maneuverability, explaining how the F6F systematically trained and deployed pilots to become an unparalleled force, resulting in the production of over 300 U.S. Navy aces. The unyielding doctrine, energy fighting perfected. The annihilation of the Japanese air fleets at the Philippine Sea, Chapter 4, was not merely a consequence of the Hellcat's superior engine and armor. It was the triumph of an entirely new tactical philosophy known as energy fighting, or high-speed, high-altitude combat. The U.S. Navy abandoned the traditional close-in dogfight, the realm of the Zero, in favor of a doctrine that weaponized the F6F's strengths, immense engine power, superior high-altitude performance, and rugged construction. The core principle was the maintenance of potential energy, altitude, and kinetic energy, speed. Hellcat pilots were rigorously trained to view combat not as a turning duel, but as a series of sloshing high-speed passes. If a pilot lost altitude or speed, they disengaged immediately, using the Hellcat's power to climb back to a position of advantage, a concept unthinkable for the Japanese pilots steeped in the Bushido tradition of never disengaging. The primary tactical expression of energy fighting was the boom and zoom maneuver. Zoom, climb above the enemy using the Hellcat's superior rate of climb, converting engine power into potential energy. Boom, dive down at maximum speed, converting potential energy back into kinetic energy. This massive acceleration gave the Hellcat a speed advantage the Zero could not match, making it impossible to target. Fire. Deliver a devastating, highly concentrated burst from the 6 synchronized 50 caliber guns, typically in a fleeting pass. Zoom away. Utilize the residual speed to immediately climb back to altitude, avoiding the slow, maneuverable fight. This tactic was brutally efficient. The Zero, caught in a high-speed dive, could not maintain the speed required to track the Hellcat, nor could its fragile airframe tolerate the high-G maneuvers necessary to follow a diving F6F. The Japanese were effectively forced to fight the Hellcat in the only regime where the Zero was instantly disadvantaged: high speed and high altitude. The thatch weave and the power of teamwork. If the boom and zoom defined the attack, the thatch weave defined the Hellcat's defense and critically emphasized American training in coordinated teamwork, another sharp contrast to the Japanese focus on the individual samurai of the sky. The thatch weave, developed by naval aviator John Ast or Jimmy Thatch, was a defensive maneuver for 2 aircraft flying in a parallel spread formation. When an enemy aircraft attacked the 6 o'clock of one fighter, that fighter would turn sharply into its wingman. Simultaneously, the wingman would turn sharply toward the leader. This maneuver essentially turned the pursuer into the pursued. The 2 Hellcats would cross paths, creating an inescapable zone of fire between them. The attacking Zero, forced to track one target, would fly directly into the sights of the weaving wingman. The beauty of the thatch weave was its simplicity, relying not on pilot skill and aerobatics, but on trust, coordination, and reliable radio communication, all elements that the Japanese system had either rejected or failed to provide. Lieutenant Commander Tanamizu's observation, Chapter 2, that we fly as individual samurai, they fight as a machine, was never truer than when viewing the execution of the thatch weave, which made a coordinated 2-plane section virtually invulnerable to the single aircraft attacks favored by the Zero pilots. The Hellcat as the ace maker.
The combination of the machine and the discipline tactical doctrine transformed the F6F into the greatest ace maker in U.S. naval history. An ace is defined as a pilot who achieves 5 or more aerial victories. By the war's end, the Hellcat had produced 305 U.S. Navy, Marine, and Fleet Air Arm aces, accounting for 75% of all Navy air-to-air victories in the Pacific. David McCampbell, the Navy's ace of aces, achieved 34 confirmed victories flying the Hellcat. His legendary 9-kill mission on October 24, 1944, Chapter 7, demonstrated the F6F's capacity for sustained, overwhelming combat performance. Cecil E. Harris, with 24 kills, his success and that of many others was directly attributable to the machine's ability to protect them during critical moments, allowing them to focus entirely on the execution of energy tactics. The reason the Hellcat produced so many aces while simultaneously surviving was systemic. Survivability. The Hellcat was forgiving. Its rugged design, armor, and self-sealing tanks allowed a less experienced American pilot to survive hits that would instantly kill a Zero pilot, ensuring that a pilot's training investment was retained for future combat. Training pipeline. American pilots arrived in the fleet with extensive training not just on flight basics, but on the precise execution of the new energy tactics. They had fired thousands of rounds in practice and drilled the thatch weave until it was automatic. Luxuries the Japanese pilot, suffering from acute fuel and ammunition shortages, could only dream of. Chapter 6. The systemic advantage. The F6F pilot rarely fought alone. He was vectored by radar, supported by reliable radio, and flew within a tightly coordinated division of 4 Hellcats. This was the antithesis of the individual, often isolated Japanese combat philosophy. The final strategic inversion. The Zero pilots were artists of aerial combat, trained to perfection in a tactical system that valued lightness and maneuverability above all else. But the Hellcat demonstrated that maneuverability is useless without survivability, and speed without altitude is merely a liability. The Zero was designed for the environment of the early war, where its unique range and turn rate granted instant supremacy. The Hellcat was designed for the environment of 1944, where industrial output, radar guidance, coordinated teamwork, and an engine that could dominate the vertical dimension were the new requirements for victory. By mid-1944, the U.S. Navy was not just replacing pilots and planes. It was replacing an entire outdated philosophy of air combat with a superior industrialized system. The Hellcat was the ultimate expression of this system, turning American pilots into effective, protected hunters who could dictate the terms of every engagement. The result was a steady, mathematically certain attrition that the Japanese high command was powerless to stop, setting the stage for the final, desperate collapse.
The primary, silent killer employed by the F6F Hellcat was not the 6.5 caliber guns, but the principle of attrition. Every veteran Zero pilot shot down at the Philippine Sea, Chapter 4, or in the countless skirmishes over Rabaul in Central Pacific represented an irreplaceable asset. The pre-war Imperial Japanese Navy pilot training program had been the world's most demanding, a grueling 3-year course that culminated in pilots entering combat with a minimum of 700 flight hours. They were not merely proficient, they were aerial artists, masters of aerobatics and gunnery, deeply versed in the complexities of their aircraft and the spiritual tenets of Bushido. This elite group formed the core of the IJN's early war dominance. By early 1944, the attrition rate had surpassed the capacity of the Japanese training system to replace the losses.
The Hellcat's survivability, Chapter 5, meant that American pilots could learn, survive mistakes, and accumulate skill, while the fragile Zero guaranteed that most Japanese trainees faced instant death upon encountering a veteran American. This created a profound, spiraling gap in combat experience. Japanese veterans were few and dying quickly, while American veterans were many and growing more skilled with every sortie. The pressure to replace losses led to a desperate and fatal acceleration of the training pipeline. Pilot type, pre-war or 1941 hours, early 1944 hours, early 1945 hours. IJN, naval pilot, 700 plus, 300, 40 to 50 kamikaze. IJA, Army pilot, 500 plus, 200, 60 to 70. The reduction was catastrophic. Pilots were entering combat with flight experience equivalent to a minimum required for a private license in the United States, not the demands of complex high-G carrier combat. The constraints of the industrial gap. The training collapse was compounded by the very industrial deficiencies that had given rise to the Hellcat's supremacy. The lack of raw materials, specifically high-octane aviation fuel and specialized alloys, meant that the training that was conducted was severely compromised. Fuel shortages. Limited fuel meant that most training was conducted in obsolete, low-performance trainers or even gliders. Pilots were learning the principles of flight, but gaining no familiarity with the high-speed, high-altitude performance characteristics of the Zero or its successor, the Zeke. Instrument flight, night flight, and formation procedures, all essential for coordinated carrier operations, were largely eliminated to save fuel. Ammunition scarcity. Gunnery practice was dramatically restricted, often limited to a mere 50 rounds per pilot before entering combat. In contrast, American pilots fired thousands of rounds in training. The Japanese trainee was expected to achieve proficiency through spiritual focus rather than material practice, a distinction that proved lethal when facing the Hellcat's coordinated volume of fire. Lieutenant Commander Yoshihiro Hashimoto, training officer at Kasumigara Naval Air Station, articulated the failure in his final report. "We are sending children to fight professionals." He documented cases where recruits like Ensign Yamamoto arrived at the front having never fired their guns in flight and having received less than a week's worth of training. Yamamoto lasted 7 minutes in his first combat sortie. The lack of basic training meant that the new pilots were not simply inferior, they were utterly defenseless. The kamikaze equation, the ultimate admission of defeat. The transformation of Japanese naval aviation into the kamikaze corps represented the final, grim admission of the Hellcat's overwhelming superiority. By October 1944, after the decimation at the Philippine Sea and the subsequent losses over Formosa, Chapter 7, conventional tactics had become statistically untenable. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, the father of the kamikaze program, justified the creation of the special attack units with a cold and desperate mathematics. If a Zero attacks a carrier conventionally, the probability of success is near zero. The Hellcats will destroy it. If the Zero becomes a bomb, the probability of hitting increases to 30%. The pilot dies either way. At least as a kamikaze, his death has meaning. The kamikaze program utilized the youngest, least trained pilots. The training hours for a kamikaze pilot were reduced to the bare minimum, 40 to 50 hours total, just enough to take off, navigate to the target, and perform a steep dive. All focus on defensive maneuvering, gunnery, and landing were eliminated to save fuel. This shift was a profound philosophical inversion. The Zero's original philosophy, 1941, individual excellence and maneuverability would guarantee victory, preserving the pilot to fly another day. The Hellcats philosophy, 1944, the system protects the pilot, allowing them to accumulate skill and survive the fight. The kamikaze philosophy, 1944, the pilot's life is inherently forfeit, used only to maximize the probability of a one-time hit. The Hellcat's dominance had reduced Japan's most elite military service to a system that valued the airframe only as a guided missile, and the pilot only as the delivery mechanism. The very term kamikaze, divine wind, reflected the belief that only an act of divine intervention, not conventional military power, could now defeat the American industrial machine and its Hellcats vanguard.
By October 1944, the American fleet was preparing for the invasion of the Philippines, and the air arm of the Imperial Navy was forced into its final, desperate conventional defense. Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, commander of the Second Air Fleet, committed everything to stop the American carrier raids on Formosa, Taiwan, which was serving as a crucial staging area for Japanese forces. This engagement, spanning from October 12 to 16, 1944, saw the commitment of over 700 Japanese aircraft, including the last trained pilots from homeland training squadrons. This was Japan's final, large-scale, conventional air counteroffensive. The ensuing 4 days of combat were characterized by an unprecedented level of Japanese self-delusion and propaganda. As the Japanese pilots returned from their sorties, they reported spectacular, almost miraculous victories over the American fleet. The official reports claimed the sinking of 26 American carriers and battleships and the destruction of 300 aircraft. These claims, widely publicized and fervently believed by the Japanese public and high command, suggested that the tide had finally turned. The reality, discovered only after the war, and through analysis of American records and Japanese gun camera footage, was catastrophically different. Actual American losses totaled only 89 aircraft, mostly due to operational incidents or damage from anti-aircraft fire. The true disaster was on the Japanese side. They lost 329 aircraft, and perhaps more critically, almost every single remaining experienced pilot. The new, barely trained pilots, Chapter 6, were consumed en masse, reinforcing the Hellcats' systematic attrition. The Formosa air campaign served as the definitive revelation. It proved that superior numbers, proximity to home bases, and desperation could no longer overcome the technological, tactical, and industrial superiority of the American forces and the F6F Hellcat. The Hellcats, guided by radar and flying the Coordinated Energy Tactics, Chapter 5, simply established an impenetrable defense. Lieutenant Sudaki Akamatsu, one of the few surviving veterans, described the slaughter in his memoirs. The Hellcats were waiting at every altitude. They had divided the sky into grids, each section covered by a division. It was not combat. It was systematic extermination. The revelation was this: the Japanese were incapable of mounting an air offensive that could successfully reach, let alone damage, the American carrier fleet. This failure directly paved the way for the invasion of the Philippines and the largest naval battle in history. The Hellcat at Leyte Gulf, McCampbell's record. The final brutal demonstration of the Hellcat's absolute air superiority came shortly thereafter, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, October 23 to 26, 1944. This battle, intended to be the final decisive battle, Operation Shogo, saw the Japanese Navy commit its entire surviving fleet, now almost devoid of effective air cover after Formosa. On October 24, 1944, Commander David McCampbell, the U.S. Navy's ace of aces, Flying a Hellcat from the USS Essex etched his name into aviation legend and provided the ultimate testimony to the F6F's tactical dominance. McCampbell, leading a flight of only 7 Hellcats, intercepted a massive Japanese force of approximately 60 aircraft, a mix of Zeros and dive bombers, heading directly toward the American fleet. The engagement lasted 90 minutes. McCampbell and his wingman, Lieutenant Roy Rushing, executed the perfect energy fighting engagement, Chapter 5, using their superior altitude, speed, and firepower to tear through the disorganized Japanese formation. The results of the single mission were staggering. McCampbell scored 9 confirmed kills, 5 Zeros and 4 bombers. This set the record for the most enemy aircraft destroyed by a single American pilot on a single mission during World War II, earning him the Medal of Honor. Rushing score 6 kills. Flight total 15 aircraft destroyed by a 7-plane division. American losses 0. Not a single Hellcat was lost, and McCampbell recorded running out of ammunition after his 9th kill, despite being outnumbered 8-1. This encounter demonstrated the complete reversal of air superiority, a complete inversion of the ratios that had governed the early war. 7 Hellcats had routed 60 Japanese aircraft, destroying 15 without loss. The encounter proved that the Hellcat was not just a superior aircraft, but a devastatingly effective system that multiplied the effectiveness of its pilots. The cultural impact of the F6F's perfection. The events of October 1944, both the Formosa lie and McCampbell's astonishing feat, had 2 crushing cultural effects on the Japanese. Destruction of the samurai ideal. The idea that a single pilot, through sheer skill, Bushido, could defeat vastly superior numbers was destroyed by McCampbell. He demonstrated that systematic superiority, delivered by a powerful machine, could achieve results far beyond the dreams of the isolated warrior. McCampbell, flying a plane stressed 13 Gs and protected by armor, embodied the anti-samurai ideal. Maximum safety, maximum material advantage, maximum lethality. Validation of kamikaze. The inability of the 700 conventional aircraft at Formosa to penetrate the Hellcat screen contrasted with the initial desperate successes of the first official kamikaze missions launched during Leyte Gulf, reinforced Admiral Unishi's fatal mathematics, Chapter 6. If the conventional fight was impossible, the suicide mission became the only logical, though desperate, military option. The air battles of October 1944 served as the final curtain call for conventional Japanese naval air power. The Hellcat had not only won the skies, it had driven the enemy to the brink of irrationality, forcing them to abandon the entire concept of the returning pilot.
The true defining weapon of the F6F Hellcat was not its 6 guns, but the manufacturing facility at Grumman's Bethpage, New York factory. The aircraft represented the peak of American industrial democracy, a system capable of producing complex, high-quality, high-performance weaponry at an incomprehensible speed. This scale of production formed the ultimate, unassailable barrier against the Japanese war effort.
April to June 1945, the Japanese launched approximately 1,900 kamikaze sorties against the massive American fleet positioned off Okinawa. The objective was not air superiority, but the sinking of enough ships to force a strategic withdrawal. In this phase of the war, the F6F Hellcat was given a new, vital mission: to serve as the unbreachable shield against human-guided missiles. The Hellcat was perfectly suited for this role due to its high speed, superb climbing rate, and devastating firepower. The Hellcats, flying in constant combat air patrols, CAPs, for weeks on end, were vectored by the ever-reliable radar system, Chapter 4, to intercept the incoming waves, often 50 to 70 miles from the fleet. This early interception was critical, as it allowed the Hellcats to engage the targets before they could break through to the anti-aircraft gunners. The mowing machine tactic. The kamikaze aircraft, often antiquated planes, bombers, or even heavily loaded Zeros flown by minimally trained pilots, Chapter 6, flew in large, determined formations. Traditional dueling tactics were irrelevant. The Hellcat pilots, recognizing the enemy's intent was solely to hit the target, developed specific high-speed interception methods to destroy the attackers as quickly and efficiently as possible. Lieutenant Eugene Valencia, commander of his famous Flying Circus division of Hellcats from the F9, developed and perfected what he termed the mowing machine tactic. This was the ultimate expression of the Hellcat's coordinated machine philosophy, Chapter 5. Line abreast formation. 4 Hellcats would fly in a tight line abreast formation separated by only about 100 yards. High-speed sweep. The formation would sweep through the Japanese formations at maximum possible speed. Sector fire. Each pilot was assigned a specific sector and was ordered to unleash a continuous burst from their 6 guns into any aircraft entering that sector. Valencia explained the ruthlessness of the tactic. We'd make one pass, climb back to altitude, and repeat. The goal was maximum saturation of fire, getting the kamikaze pilots no opportunity to maneuver or execute their terminal dive. The Hellcats' armored construction allowed them to absorb debris or occasional ineffective fire from the targets, reinforcing their role as the superior weapon system. Chapter 8. Valencia himself shot down 23 Japanese aircraft during the campaign, demonstrating the Hellcats' lethality in this new, desperate form of air combat. The final, stark mathematics of the Battle of Okinawa proved to be the final, crushing statistical victory for the Hellcat and the American system. Total F6F combat sorties, 38,038. Total victories claimed, 2,351. Total losses to enemy, 249, which an estimated 100 were lost to kamikaze collisions or flak, not fighters. Final kill ratio, 9.5 to 1 over the campaign. More significant than aerial combat ratio, however, was the Hellcat's success in its new defensive role. The F6F, along with other U.S. fighters, prevented approximately 80% of all kamikaze aircraft from reaching the American fleet. While the losses to the fleet were severe, dozens of ships damaged or sunk, the Hellcat barrier prevented the total destruction of the fleet that Admiral Onisha had hoped for. The F6F, the heavy armored protector, had saved the invasion. The post-war irony and the final victory. The effectiveness of the Hellcat in 1945 was a grim validation of the Japanese industrial deficiency. The Zero pilots were now flying machines that were simply too slow and too fragile to survive the interception. The Hellcat, with its high-powered engine and rugged airframe, could absorb the stresses of a high-speed passes and the necessary quick-turning maneuvers required to shoot down the persistent kamikaze. The final symbolic act of the air war occurred on August 15, 1945. After Emperor Hirohito's surrender broadcast, Ensign Clarence Moore of VF-31, flying Hellcat from the USS Below Wood, intercepted a Japanese Yokosuka D for a wide-duty dive-baller. The Japanese pilot, apparently unaware of the surrender, was approaching the American fleet. 2 short bursts from the Hellcat's 6 guns ended the attack and, officially, recorded the last aerial victory of World War II. The pilot who dismissed the heavy American machine, Chapter 1,
was defeated by the machine that protected its warrior until the final, official moment of the conflict. The Hellcat story at Okinawa was the final chapter in its evolution, from an offensive weapon that destroyed the enemy's skill, Chapter 5, to a defensive shield that protected its own fleet. Its success meant that the U.S. could conduct amphibious assaults with impunity from the air, cementing the strategic revolution it had authored. Chapter 10. The F6F was until the very end the ultimate arbiter of air power in the Pacific.
Following Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, the first American aircraft to land at Atsugiri Airfield were 12 F6F Hellcats from the USS Yorktown. The sight was a profound moment of reckoning for the assembled Japanese pilots, mechanics, and ground crew. Here, for the first time, they could see their tormentor up close, static, and real. The aircraft they had ridiculed as a heavy, clumsy failure now sat before them, a symbol of their complete defeat. American ace Lieutenant Robert Fasu, 19 victories, demonstrated the Hellcat's capabilities to the former adversaries. His casual aerobatics, the tight loops, rolls, and steep climbs that would have instantly torn the wing spars from a Zero, left the Japanese pilots speechless. Fasu explained that the aircraft was stressed for 13 Gs, and despite the abuse they'd put it through, he had never managed to break one. This physical durability was the final undeniable proof that the Hellcat's weight represented not weakness, but the strength of an industrial democracy that could afford to protect its warriors. Japan's engineering post-mortem was equally devastating. Professor Jiro Horikoshi, Zero designer, and his teams were given access to captured F6F airframes and engines. They discovered the true extent of the American industrial superiority. Horikoshi concluded, quote, "We designed an aircraft for 1941. They designed an aircraft system for 1945. The realization was that while Japan had been perfecting a beautiful singular weapon, the sword, America had been perfecting the vast, interchangeable, and ever-evolving industrial age system that manufactured, maintained, and guided the weapon." The Hellcat's legacy, statistical and human cost. The F6F Hellcat's legacy can be reduced to simple, unyielding mathematics that told a profound story of victory. Overall kill ratio 19.3 to 1. Production total 12,275 Hellcats produced in 30 months. Ace production 305 U.S. Navy aces produced. Zero kill count, the Hellcat destroyed 5,223 enemy aircraft in aerial combat. The human cost for Japan was catastrophic and irreversible. Of the estimated 18,000 naval aviators who'd started the war, fewer than 100 truly combat-experienced pilots remained by August 1945. The transformation of naval aviation from an elite fighting force to a kamikaze corps, Chapter 6, was the ultimate acknowledgement that conventional combat was impossible against the Hellcats' coordinated air defense, Chapter 9. The final judgment, Samurai versus System. In 1962, American and Japanese veterans gathered for a symposium on Pacific War aviation. The discussions provided the final historical judgment on the F6F versus A6M rivalry. Captain David McCampbell, 34 victories, the Navy's ace of aces, stated simply and unequivocally, "The Hellcat won the Pacific Air War, period. It destroyed Japanese aviation and made our victory inevitable." Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, the veteran who had laughed at the Hellcat in 1943, Chapter 1, provided the most honest and insightful testimony, reflecting the evolution of his understanding. Quote, "The Zero was a superior fighter. The Hellcat was a superior weapon system. We never understood the difference until too late. We brought swords to a gunfight and wondered why we lost.
Sakai's testimony encapsulated the entire cultural collision. The samurai tradition emphasized individual excellence, bushido, spiritual strength, and the acceptance of death as the ultimate goal. The Hellcat embodied the antithesis: systematic efficiency, material superiority, and the preservation of life. The philosophical gulf meant that the Japanese pilots trained in a culture that forbade retreat could not adapt the Hellcat's energy fighting doctrine, which required refusing combat when disadvantaged. The last word of the enemy. Saburo Sakai lived until the year 2000, becoming a symbol of the war's veterans. In his final interviews, he delivered the most powerful final assessment of the Hellcat's dominance, a judgment that went beyond statistics to the profound moral and strategic defeat. Quote, "The Zero made Japan a great naval power. The Hellcat made Japan realize it was never as great as it believed. Every Japanese pilot who survived the war survived because a Hellcat pilot chose to let them live. That is the ultimate defeat, existing at your enemy's discretion." End quote. The F6F Hellcat had achieved total victory. It entered service weighing twice the Zero. Carrying armor the Zero did not. Powered by an engine the Japanese could not build, armed with weapons they could not match, guided by radars they could not detect, flown by pilots they could not equal in training, and reduced in numbers they could not comprehend. The Japanese pilots laughed at the F6F Hellcat because they failed to understand that every pound of its weight represented a strength, the strength of industrial capacity, pilot protection, and coordinated technology. By the time that laughter had faded, their mockery had turned to desperation, their confidence to complete collapse, and their Air Force into a historical footnote. The Hellcat had destroyed an entire philosophy of warfare, securing its legacy as the decisive weapon that crushed the rising sun's zenith and defined the modern industrial age of air combat.